What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. Today we're going to check out the macros that I've created for Protection Warriors. Now, this is the tank spec for Warriors, and the rotation is pretty easy, but there are a lot of things to consider. It is a 3-button macros setup, but you'll understand why when we look at the macros. Before we do that though, let's go ahead and open up our talent tree here, and you can see what I've got going on. This is a Mythic Plus oriented multi-target build, really good for multiple types of content like dungeons, obviously Mythic Plus, and of course open world stuff. It's really good for that. You can just run around the world, pick up a bunch of enemies, and just spam away, and it's great. It's fun. I love Protection Warrior. It's actually a pretty fun class to get into if you want to tank. But yeah, either way, let's go ahead and look at a few things. I'll try to explain some things as we go, and we'll go from there. This is, of course, I've been doing this a lot. This is a build that I've taken right out of Wowhead, so it's just following a pretty solid, system here. Obviously, taking things like Thunderclap is important. We're taking other abilities. There are going to be some abilities, like I didn't mention this in my last Warrior video, but like we've got Stormbolt here. We've also, I think we took Shockwave. People wonder why aren't these included in the macros. They're more utility than damage. Even though they do deal some damage, they're not worth the global cooldown to be in the normal rotation. So these are great abilities, but they're just not ones that you want to use all the time. So that's why they're not included. We get down here in the bottom. This is where kind of the important stuff is. We've obviously taken Avatar. We've favored Thunderous Roar over Champion's Spear. I love Champion's Spear, but it is a ground targeting ability, and while we could make it work, and we've actually taken Ravager on this side, another ground targeting ability, if I don't have to take it, I won't, and Thunderous Roar does just as well, and it's a lot easier to use. So that's why we come over here on this side, and we've got our pretty standard stuff. We've taken Devastator, so that we don't have to use Devastate anymore. That becomes passive, which is one less ability we have to use in the macro, of course. And then we're going to take Rend, but we don't have to ever use it. And the reason why we don't have to use it is because we have Thunderclap. So that's going to solve that problem. Now we've taken other things like Demoralizing Shouts. This is a cooldown that we'll be using a lot, but there are other cooldowns that we won't be using in the macros, and those are your more defensive oriented cooldowns like Shield Wall, Spell Block, different things like that might be in here. Any of those types of abilities we're not going to be using in the macro, but everything else is pretty standard. We get down here at the bottom, we got Shield Charge. We've also got Booming Voice, which is going to be putting Demoralizing Shout in our rotation. And then, of course, we've got Ravager. As I said, it's kind of hard not to pick this ability. It's just so good, and we can make it work. I feel like I've made it work pretty well, and hopefully it'll work out as I test this more and other people test it as well. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at these macros. Now, we have 3 macros here, and they're divided up based on how you're going to be spending your rage. So we've got 1 for Revenge, 1 for Ignore Pain, and 1 for Execute. And that's basically what's going to determine when you're going to use each macro. It depends on how you want to spend your rage. So for the most part, especially if you're out in the world, I've noticed I tend to just use the 1 for Revenge the most. That's the one that is kind of like on my main button, the one that I spam the most. And then of course there's the Ignore Pain one when you need to activate Ignore Pain, and then when you get in the Execute phase, you can use that one. That one's a little finicky because of how Execute works and how it has like a range of rage that it spends, but it can still work, and it'll use Execute when you have enough rage. So let's go ahead and we'll just take a look at the one with Revenge, and we'll go from there, and I'll show you the difference. So yeah, so starting off here, we like to start with Impending Victory, making sure this gets used as often as possible or as early as possible, so that way when we switch targets, we know we can keep using that ability, use it from the start, that kind of thing. Then we get into our priority loop, and this is like a reverse priority loop. I like these, and we have our main abilities with within this priority loop. Our shorter cooldown abilities, things that we're going to be needing to use most often, are going to be in this loop. It's going to follow this pattern. It's going to do it 3 times, and then it's going to bust out of the loop and do everything that's on the outside of the loop next. Okay, so at the top of this priority list, we have Shield Slam. This is arguably our most important ability. We're going to be using this one all the time. It can reset a lot, so we want to make sure we are using it as much as possible. Now, I debated whether or not this was a good idea, but I decided to go for it. I went ahead and put Shield Block in with Shield Slam, because Shield Block is an off cooldown ability, which means you can use it with any other ability. I went ahead and put it in here. It will cost some rage, but we're using it as much as possible to keep it up so that we can get more damage out of our Shield Slam. So that's why I decided to put it in. Now, Shield Block has 2 charges, so it's going to use them right away, and then it's just going to behave as normal. So there may be times where this is not favorable, but it just makes it easier to handle Shield Block. You basically don't ever have to worry about pressing it separately. There are some talents that can improve Shield Block, that can extend the duration of Shield Block, and that might be something to consider switching to for this macro setup, perhaps. But it's entirely up to you. There are other talents that people tend to favor more, but with this specific setup, we may benefit from taking that specific talent. And I'll show you real quick what that talent's called. It is called Heavy Repercussions, and that will cause Shield Slam to generate 2 more rage and extend the duration of Shield Block by 1 second. And if you're using, Shield Slam a lot, then that could be really important. So I do want to make that very clear that could be a problem, not getting Shield Block up enough. So that may be one way to remedy it, but I just figured it was easier to put Shield Block in this macro so you're getting the most out of it without ever having to worry about it. But if it's something that you want to manage separately, feel free to remove Shield Block from this macro, all 3 of these macros actually, and manage it separately. That is entirely up to you. Avatar is also included here with the combat command to make sure that it doesn't get used outside of combat on accident, but it's another off the global cooldown ability, and we use it all the time, so it's there. Then, of course, we have Start Attack to make sure that we are swinging our melee weapon, or slinging it, whichever. But next up, we have our Rage Spender, which in this case is Revenge. I want to try to make sure that we're using it enough so that, it's not overcapping our rage, but we're also maybe not using it too much, so we always have a little bit of rage. And that's mostly achieved through how many loops we go through here before we try to use other abilities on the outside of the loops. And so that's kind of the idea there. And in my experience so far, it really depends. Sometimes you're going to run low on rage, other times you might overcap rage, but in general, I do see my rage going up and going down quite a lot, which I feel most comfortable with because it feels like it's just, it's doing what it's supposed to do for the most part, but it's never going to be perfect, and that's always something that you have to accept when you use, sequences like these where it's not as accurate as what a person who is skilled can actually achieve. So then last up, we have Thunderclap, again with a combat command, making sure we're not just stomping randomly on accident. But again, we put this at the bottom to give us time to get into range before we get to it. And since it has a bit of a longer cooldown, it's not used. It's used a lot, and it will be used a lot even in this macro. But we're just prioritizing those other abilities first to make sure that we are getting those off as much as possible. But Thunderclap should still be used extremely regularly. So once we go through this loop 3 times in this pattern, we bust out of the loop and we start getting into these longer cooldown abilities, and that's why these abilities are on the outside, because they have such long cooldowns. It's kind of counterintuitive to try to put them in a sequence loop where they're not being used very often and bogging down the macro. So basically everything outside the loop will be used, the macro will attempt to use the abilities on the outside less often. And that's good because you don't use these abilities very often because they have such long cooldowns. So, Shield Charge is first. Next up, we have Demoralizing shout. This is important because we get rage from this, so that's good, and we're also just using it. Again, putting these at the bottom so that way, like, we're in range when we use them, like demoralizing shout, and we'll get to Ravager. You know, we put them at the bottom even though they have a high priority, so that way it's giving us time to get through our main rotation and get in range before we actually try to use these, and we're not wasting them. So even though it might be a little bit later when you actually activate this stuff, once you start going, it should start activating these regularly, and that's what's more important in the long run, even though it does kind of make us less efficient early on technically, because we could be using these sooner than the macro will probably get to them. Again, that's just kind of like, in my mind, that's the best way to do it, rather than like spamming away at the macro before you're in range and accidentally shouting at nothing and getting nothing out of it. So that's the idea there. Same with, Thunderous Roar, same idea. And then, of course, we have Ravager at the bottom. Same idea. This is a ground targeting ability. All of these, we've put the combat command in to make sure that we don't use them outside of combat. So that's very helpful. But then, of course, we have an @player command added with Ravager. That way it will put Ravager at your feet, and so once you are in range and you've had time to get this macro firing off, then it'll use Ravager, and you should be in range, and enemies will be where they're supposed to be before you actually use it, which to me is great. But of course, you are free to remove Ravager or any of these other abilities from the macro if you don't like how the macro is handling them, or you want to use them more often. That's entirely up to you, but the whole goal here is to make things as simple as possible, and I feel like this is the best way that I can go about doing that, even though it is 3 buttons, of course. And so, of course, we look at those other buttons. We have one for Ignore Pain, and it's what you'd expect. Everything's the exact same, except in the same place that you would do Revenge, you will do Ignore Pain. Now, the thing about Ignore Pain is that Ignore Pain is technically off the global cooldown, which means that you could use this at any point in time with any other ability. So even if your global cooldown is active, once you get to Ignore Pain on this list, it's going to use it all the time as long as you have enough rage for it. So you will see your rage drop more if you spam away at this macro. So only use this enough to get the Ignore Pain out there. It's a good option, say, if you want to start with Ignore Pain and make sure you get that up as quickly as possible. You don't want to spend your rage on Revenge before you use your Ignore Pain. You can switch over to this macro until you've activated Ignore Pain and then go back to the other one. That's one way to do it, of course, and that's why we've made this macro. So then, of course, we have our Execute macro, which again is the exact same thing. It's going to do Execute in the place of Ignore Pain or Revenge, and that's basically how it's going to work. Now, I could have technically consolidated these macros into one button by using modifiers on this block where we have our rage spenders, but there were 2 things that I considered. Number 1, controller users like myself cannot benefit from modifiers, and number 2, it's a matter of how we're spending our rage and having really solid control over how that's being used, so that way we're not feeling pressured to have to hold down a modifier at the right time. It's easier to me to just simply hit a separate button entirely, but you're welcome to edit these. I'm not big on preventing people from editing my stuff, so feel free. If you want to consolidate them, you totally can. Just add in the modifier commands if you know how to do that, and you'd be good to go. But for me, it's just easier, and since I play the controller, I just use 3 separate buttons, all based around what I want to spend my rage on, keeping track of my Ignore Pain, waiting until I get to a point where I might want to use Execute, switching over to that, and it's pretty standard. Like I said, 90% of the time, I'm just using the Revenge one, occasionally switching over to Ignore Pain. And so, and there are other things I considered. I thought about making like a cast sequence for rage spending, so it like cycles between Ignore Pain and Revenge, but I feel like that's just too limiting and too rigid of how you might want to spend your rage, so I didn't feel like that was a good idea either. Of course, your mileage may vary, but it's all a matter of how much rage you have. Sometimes you might overcap, sometimes you might not. Sometimes abilities may not fire off as quickly as you would like, but the goal is to try to make it as smooth as possible, and I feel like for the most part these work at that pretty well. I leveled an entire character in PROT using these macros, and I had a lot of fun doing it, so that was cool. Of course, I did a lot of Mist of Pandaria content, but that's hard to gauge because of how easy the mop content is, but I've also done some those elemental things, or what do they call, the echo things out in the world. I've done some of those as well with PROT, and it was fine. So, like I said, mileage may vary. I'd love to know what you think about it if you use this macro. If you do, you feel free to import these macros into your GNOME sequencer. Don't forget to add hotkeys to them, and let me know what you think about them in the comments below. With all that being said, I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button, and feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.